All of Stradivari's instruments have fascinating stories, but some of them have really amazing stories that just adds further to their mystique and fame. One such Strad is the Kochański Violin, which takes an amazing journey through the hands of various owners. Most of them good, but some of them bad. And these violins can take on the mystique of their multiple owners, almost becoming like a living organism of themselves with a story to tell. I'm going to quote from the information that Tarisio hold on this Stradivarius. This violin once belonged to the Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. When the revolution began, he offered the violin to the Polish violinist Paweł Kochański in order to keep the violin safe from harm. Kochański then attempted to flee Russia in a train car carrying farm animals with his best friend Arthur Rubinstein. When the train was stopped by revolutionary soldiers, Kochański had the idea to play revolutionary melodies on his violin, which saved his life. When I acquired the Kochański several decades later, everyone thought I was crazy, as it was at the time way beyond my means. But for me, it was an unbelievable dream come true, a privilege to be able to express myself through these 4 strings and some wood miraculously put together by a genius. Yes, these violins are much more than the sum total of their parts and often have incredible stories to tell. So this is Pierre Amoyal speaking now, continues. Amoyal led a charmed existence from his studies with Heifetz, an ideal career, until the dream was interrupted when the Kochański was stolen from him in Italy. It was like something from a horror movie. The person who stole the violin had heard it was one of the most famous and valuable violins of Stradivarius and thought he could resell it. He was involved also in drug dealing and was assassinated a couple of months later, but not before he had time to sell the violin to an antique dealer who also thought he could resell it. But after a few attempts, he realized that nobody was prepared to buy such a valuable and well-known instrument. The only possible buyer was me. The transactions were agonizingly long, but with the help of a specialized lawyer in Rome, known for his skill in negotiating difficult cases with gangsters and kidnappers, and the Italian Carabinieri, the horror story turned at last into a fairy tale when the violin was returned to Amoyal. It came back absolutely intact, and now my love for it is even greater, he says. Pierre Amoyal indeed had to prize his Stradivarius from the criminal underworld. In 1987, he was about to leave a hotel in Saluzzo, Italy, when a small-time gangster stole his Porsche and sped off with the 1717 Kochański inside. It was 4 years before the violin was recovered, the instrument having passed between thieves and into the hands of an antiques dealer who was known to the police. Eventually, a judge allowed a mafioso to be taken out of jail temporarily to set up an exchange with the dealer. The sting operation ended, as with the recovery of the Sinsheimer Stradivarius in Germany 2 years ago, as per the Strad of November 2009, with the police storming in and arresting everyone. Reflecting on his experience, Amoyal says, "I was fortunate that, for the police in Italy, such an important instrument represented something special. They did the best they could, but it was not enough, and I had to hire private detectives and a lawyer who had experience of dealing with the mafia and kidnap cases. However, at the end, the police did a very good job. They were careful. I told the prosecutor that I would prefer never to see the violin again, rather than it be destroyed by criminals knowing they were about to be caught." It doesn't say whether he had received a payout, insurance payout. Probably he must have. Although I don't know if they pay out if you leave your fiddle in your car and someone steals your car. But regardless, clearly Amoyal was fighting hard to get this violin back and was eventually successful. It must have caused him tremendous stress during those 4 years. So looking through the owners, Tarisio mentions that the Tsar himself owned the violin, but also lists Count Matvei Vilgorsky, Count Loris Melikov, Then Paul Kochański until 1920. Between 1922 and 1976, anonymous owner, sold by Hill & Sons. And then between 1976 and 1987, Pierre Amoyal owned the violin. It was reported stolen in 1987 and remained lost until 1991 when it was recovered, as we recounted, and Pierre Amoyal was reunited with his fiddle and is the current owner as it stands today. So now let's have a look at the lives of the two illustrious violinists who have owned this violin. Firstly, Paul Kochański, violinist and composer originally from Poland. He owned the violin until 1920. He was a Polish Jewish violin composer born on the 30th of August 1887 and he died on the 12th of January 1934. He was born in Odessa, Ukraine. Like many others of his generation, Kochański studied violin first with his father and then at age 7 with Emil Mianarski, whose teacher had been Leopold Auer. At 7, he went to the school of the Odessa Imperial Music Society to learn with Emil Mianarski, a former pupil of Leopold Auer. In 1901, Kochański, then aged 14, was summoned by Mianarski to become concertmaster of the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra. Imagine becoming concertmaster at age 14 only. Mianarski also took charge of the upbringing and education of the boy, treating him like a son and stating that he believed he would become a world-class soloist. After that, in 1903, with sponsorship from leading Warsaw families arranged by Mianarski, Kochański went to Brussels to study with César Thompson at the Brussels Conservatoire. There, after only 4 months, he received the Premier Prix avec la plus grande distinction, first prize with the greatest distinction. Just 4 months it took him. Kochański was evidently aware of the different characteristics of the two schools, attributing his right-hand interpretative style to his Russian training and that of his technical left hand to the Belgian Thompson. It was at this point, as he was beginning his itinerant virtuoso career, that he met Arthur Rubinstein through the invitation of Julius Wertheim. They immediately realized their shared musical sympathies, but the friendship, rich with youthful energy, really took off in 1907 with their concerts for the Warsaw Philharmonic, including duo performances of Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata and Tchaikovsky's Piano Trio with the cellist J. Sablik. They went on in 1908 with Joseph Jarosinski, a patron of Kochański's, to make a triumphant tour of European capitals, including Berlin, Paris, London, Carlsbad. And then in 1908-9, Kochański and Rubinstein performed the César Franck Violin Sonata in A, the Kreutzer again, and a Brahms Trio for the Warsaw Philharmonic. The Brahms Trio included Eli Kochański, a cellist and Paul's gifted brother. From 1909 to 1911, Kochański taught at the Warsaw Conservatory as professor of violin. And then he goes on to give other performances with Arthur Rubinstein. They also gave the first performance of Karol Szymanowski's Violin Sonata in D minor. Kochański married Zofia Kohn, who had previously held a hopeless passion for Julius Wertheim. His father-in-law, a lawyer, brought him a Stradivarius violin for his wedding present. That's not the first time I've heard of a violinist being given a Strad as a wedding present. Szymanowski dedicated his Violin Concerto No. 1 in 1916 to Kochański, who contributed the cadenza. He later produced violin transcriptions of a number of Szymanowski's works, as well as of others such as Schubert, Faye, Ravel, and Bizet. Other composers who wrote for Kochański included Prokofiev, Glazunov, and interestingly, Englishman Arnold Bax, who had been romantically involved with a Ukrainian girl and visited St. Petersburg. and begun to incorporate a Russian influence on his compositions. Kochański would later mingle with Igor Stravinsky, Pablo Casals, Jacques Thibault, Lionel Tertis, Pierre Moulton and others. Stravinsky dedicated a transcription for violin and piano of 3 pieces from the Firebird to Kochański, who participated in 2 of Rubinstein's recitals at Bechstein Hall in 1914, one of which was devoted entirely to contemporary music. In 1916, he succeeded Leopold Auer teaching at the St. Petersburg Conservatory until 1918. During that time he became friends with Sergei Prokofiev and gave the composer some assistance on matter of technique for the solo part of his Violin Concerto No. 1 in D major. He moved on to teach at the Kiev Conservatory from 1918 to 1920. In January 1920 he premiered Szymanowski's Nocturne and Tarantella in Warsaw. Kochański was to have given the premiere of the Prokofiev Violin Concerto in 1917, but the composer's vacillations and other preoccupations delayed the occasion until 1923, by which time he and Kochański had lost touch. In 1920 he lived briefly in London and gave a joint recital with Rubinstein and went on to travel before setting off for New York City. From this point on, around 1921-1922, Kochański's career was based in New York. He chose Brahms' Violin Concerto for his Carnegie Hall debut. This single performance prompted his immediate popularity amongst American audiences, and his success there was secured, leading to further opportunities to champion new music, as well as to head the violin faculty at the Juilliard School in the final years before his death. And so he taught at Juilliard School from 1924, heading the violin faculty until his death of cancer at age 46 in 1934. In 1933, when he was already dying, he helped Szymanowski complete his second violin concerto and gave the premiere. When published after Kochański's death, the score bore a dedication to him. A non-religious ceremony was held at the school, attended by 1,500 people. His pallbearers included Arturo Toscanini, Frank Damrosch, Walter Damrosch, Jascha Heifetz, Vladimir Horowitz, some big names, Fritz Kreisler, Serge Kusevitsky, Leopold Stokowski and Ephraim Zembelist, some massive names in there. According to Rubinstein, who loved him as his dearest friend, Kochański enjoyed conversations with straightforward people, played cards, sometimes spoke roughly. He could be abrupt, impatient or rude, and could even get angry and walk out, slamming doors behind him. He died in 1934 intestate, in other words, without leaving a will, leaving some $20,000 behind, aged just 46, so quite young really to die. Dr. John Erskine, the dean of the Juilliard School, said of him, "Magnificent as his playing and teaching were, I think he was a bigger man than we had yet realized. His influence and his fame were only beginning. Had he lived, I believe he would have distinguished himself in composition, to which his attention was turning." Considering his stature and generation, Kochański recorded relatively little. The only electric recording is a performance from 1932 of Brahms' Violin Sonata No. 3 Opus 108 with Rubinstein, which reveals him as a powerful player in the prime from which he was so sadly cut down. His tone is vibrant and full with a relatively fast and tight vibrato. Elsewhere, this sonata is full of excitement, mainly due to the use of expressive tempo rubato, which makes the last movement particularly thrilling. Carl Flesch praised him as an inimitable interpreter, excellent arranger, charming conversationalist. Homemade film footage shows him as an entertaining and generous host, an affectionately humorous imitation of cellist Pablo Casals being one of his party pieces. The lineup of 41 musically eminent pallbearers at his funeral, including Toscanini, Heifetz, Kreisler and Zembelist, is testament to the respect he earned as a musician. Overall, Kochański was clearly a great player who retained the charisma and excitement of 19th century playing, but with a more modern tonal gloss. As such, he deserves to be much better appreciated. Much the same as Ginette Neveu, whose grave I visited recently. Had these kind of violinists lived longer, they may have become much more famous than they already are. Let's move on to Pierre Amoyal now, the second eminent owner of the Kochański. Of course, we should probably say the third, since the Tsar of Russia himself owned it, but the second great player to own the Kochański violin. Pierre Amoyal was born on the 22nd of June 1949 in Paris. He's a French violinist and is the artistic director of the Conservatory of Lausanne. He owns the Kochański Stradivarius of 1717. It was stolen from him in 1987 and recovered in 1991. He had to endure 4 years of stress until he got it back. He clearly loved this violin very much. Loves it very much, should I say. He studied at the Conservatoire of Paris, graduating at age 12, so similar trajectory to Kochański himself, with a first prize in 1961. While studying at the Paris Conservatoire, I was particularly influenced by Gaston Poulet, Roland Charmy and the Quatuor Calvet, says Amoyal. He then won the Ginette Neveu Prize in 1963 and the Paganini Prize in 1964. At age 17, he travelled to Los Angeles for 5 years of study with Jascha Heifetz, which culminated in participating in chamber music recordings with Heifetz. Wow. Could Pierre Amoyal perhaps be one of the most prominent of the students of Heifetz? Because not all of them have gone on to be internationally recognised as famous violinists. All of them are amazing, but only a few, should we say, have truly become world class. And Amoyal perhaps could be maybe the most famous student of Heifetz, certainly in Europe. In an interview with the Strad magazine, this is what Amoyal says about his experience with Heifetz. He says, "Heifetz gave me a broader outlook on the world of violin playing and the ingredients needed to build an international career. He had such a wide understanding of what it meant to be a musician and knew every facet of the job. It was an extraordinary privilege to be guided by him, and although it was a shock at first, I absorbed it with lots of passion and interest." At 17 years old, I was originally supposed to study in Moscow with David Oistrakh. The move to LA all started with a lesson with Heifetz in Paris. It was horrible. He was so cruel. I played every possible concerto, scales in tenths and so much more. Once it ended, I never wanted to hear from the man again. But a month later, I received a telegram inviting me to his studio. I was conflicted, but ultimately chose to go to him. I very simply wanted to understand how he played the way he did. When I nervously approached Oistrakh with my decision, he responded, "If you don't go and study with Heifetz, I will." He recounts how he once performed the Saint-Saëns introduction and Rondo Capriccioso for Heifetz. He says, "I was terrified. His recording of the piece was my ideal." I agree, it's definitive. After I played, he said, "I really don't like it, but don't change your notes, because if you play like that, you will be very successful." I realised at that moment what it meant to be a great teacher, and when I returned to Paris, I immediately accepted the role of professor at the Conservatoire, partly because it was a way to remember what he had taught me and share it with others. I always kept to his ideology of developing students' talents rather than forcing them all to sound the same. You don't make violinists like you make croissant. Interestingly, during the time he was actually studying with Heifetz, he actually won the Ionescu Prize in 1970 and was touring, making numerous recordings and playing with major conductors such as Sir Georg Solti, Pierre Boulez and Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic. As well as teaching at the Conservatoire in Paris and at the Conservatory of Lausanne, he also taught at the Mozarteum University of Salzburg, the Académie Internationale d'Été of Nice, and in Japan. In 2002, he founded the Camerata de Lausanne, a string orchestra. He also created and organised the violin and piano masterclasses of the Music Academy of Lausanne since 1991. He was made a Chevalier of Arts and Letters in 1985 and promoted to Knight of the National Order of Merit in 1995. He also received the Prix du Rayonnement de la Fondation Vaudoise pour la Culture in 2002 and the Prix de Lausanne in 2006. Among his Italian pupils was the violinist Alessio Bedoli. I've been to Lausanne myself many times. I used to live not far from there in France, just across the border. It's a beautiful place. I remember it being quite hilly though, but beautiful place by the lake there. So that's the story of this amazing violin and two of its illustrious owners. What an incredible fiddle, what an incredible violin from the time it was smuggled away out of Russia on an animal train to the time it was stolen by the mafia, and the amazing lengths that Amoyal went to get it back. And thankfully, it is now safely in his hands again. And this violin, no doubt, will continue on its interesting travels, unless perhaps it ends up in a museum where now a lot of Strads probably do belong. But it's an incredible violin and still being played.
One day Heifetz came to our class carrying a violin case, which he put on the piano. During my lesson he told me, please, try the violin on the piano. I opened the case and found in it a fantastic violin by Violin. I continued the lesson with it, as instructed. Heifetz didn't say a word. At the end of the lesson, he asked me, what do you think of this violin? I replied, well, of course, I've never put hands on anything better than this before. It's wonderful. He looked at me and said, consider it yours. And that was all. I went back home and, honestly, I didn't understand how this violin came into my life. Later, I found out from the shop in Los Angeles that Heifetz himself had purchased it for me with his own money. As related by Pierre Amoyal,